The cardiologist had barely turned the corner at the end of the hallway when I heard my son's voice through the gap in the door. He wasn't whispering. He never learned how to be careful when he thought no one important was listening. 800,000 on the low end, he said. Probably closer to 1 million too if we list in May, before the summer market floods. We don't even need to wait. Once she signs the POA, we can transfer the cottage into the numbered company and the whole thing becomes untouchable. A pause. Then my daughter-in-law's voice, smoother, more practiced at hiding what she meant. What about the ring? She was wearing it when they brought her in. The ring's not worth much. 3 grand, maybe 4, leave it for now. No, I wanted appraised before anything gets sorted. My cousin knows someone in Yorkville. I lay completely still. The cardiac monitor beside me beeped its steady 4-second rhythm. My hands were folded on the blanket. I kept my breathing slow, measured, the same breath I used in courtrooms for 22 years as a Crown attorney, when the defense said something that made me want to stand up too fast. I kept my eyes closed. I let them stand in that hallway and keep talking. Before I tell you what happened after, I have to tell you about the ring. My husband bought it at an estate sale in Listowel in 1994, 4 years before we married. He paid $60 for it at a barn table between a broken clock and a box of Reader's Digest condensed novels. It had come from an Irish family who'd brought it over in the 50s, a small cluster of garnets set in yellow gold, modest and worn at the band. He kept it in the breast pocket of his work jacket for 2 years because he couldn't figure out the right moment. Then one August evening on the dock of an unfinished cottage on Georgian Bay, the foundation still smelling of fresh concrete, the inside walls still bare stud frames, the dock railing not yet sanded, he pulled it out and asked me. We'd bought that land together in the spring of 1998 for $45,000. Bare rock and spruce trees and a narrow strip of sandy beach that barely qualified as a beach. Everyone thought we were out of our minds. 2 people in their early 30s putting everything they had into a piece of Canadian Shield waterfront when we should have been saving for something sensible. My mother-in-law didn't speak to us about it for a full year. But Walter understood. Walter had known my husband since they were 17, working summers at the same lumberyard outside Barrie. They stayed close through everything. Walter's divorce, my husband's cancer scare in 2009, the lean years and the better ones. Walter drove down from Barrie every long weekend for 3 summers to help us build that cottage. He mixed concrete in October when it was 4 degrees and the ground was beginning to frost at night. He hung drywall and argued with my husband for 45 minutes about which direction the dock should face, and then built it exactly as my husband wanted and never mentioned being right about it. He was there the morning we finally put the key in the lock of a finished door. The 3 of us stood on that dock with bad coffee in old mugs and watched the sun come up over the water, and nobody said anything for a long time because nothing needed to be said. My son grew up in that cottage. Every summer of his childhood, he learned to swim off that dock. He sulked through his teenage years on that porch. He brought his first serious girlfriend there at 23 and called me the week after to tell me he thought she might be the one. I cooked dinner and smiled and told him I was happy for him, and I meant it. Now he was standing outside my hospital room at Hamilton General, running numbers on that cottage like it was a line item in a spreadsheet. My daughter-in-law had been consulting an estates lawyer in Toronto for 3 weeks before I was admitted. I found that out later. The plan was already in motion before my heart gave anyone a reason to move faster. When the footsteps finally faded down the hallway and I was sure they were gone, I reached over and adjusted my IV line. I stared at the fluorescent light on the ceiling for a long time. Outside the window, the October sky over Hamilton was the color of old pewter. I was not going to sign anything. Walter arrived at 8 that evening. A nurse let him in because he'd told them he was family, and in every way that counted, he was. He came wearing his old green field jacket, the same one he'd worn the day we poured the cottage foundation, still with a faint rust stain on the left cuff from a bolt that had been left in the pocket too long. And he sat in the plastic chair beside my bed and looked at me the way he used to look at my husband when my husband was trying to make a bad decision sound reasonable. I know, I said, don't. Your son called me this afternoon, he said. He wanted to know if I had any old documents about the property, surveys, permits. He said he was getting things organized for you. I said nothing. Walter leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees. His hands were still the hands of someone who had spent decades doing physical work. Thick at the knuckles, scarred at the fingertips. They were folded now with the patience of a man who had learned how to wait. Tell me what you need, he said. He was 68 years old. He drove a truck with a cracked windshield he kept meaning to fix. He had a pension that wasn't quite enough and a garden that kept him busy, in summers, and a habit of arriving when things were hard. He had carried my husband's casket in October rain 4 years ago and stayed after the reception to wash dishes when everyone else had gone home. "They're going to try to get me to sign a power of attorney for property," I said. "Before I leave this hospital, they think I'm too medicated to read what I'm signing." He watched me. "I need you to be my eyes outside this room," I said, "and I need you to make a call. My husband had a contact at Toronto General, a cardiac specialist named Dr. Ramirez. I want him to look at my file. The diagnosis I received today doesn't sit right with me." "What did they say?" "Stage D heart failure, limited prognosis." I said it flat, because that was the only way I could say it at all without something coming apart. But the echocardiogram was read by a resident. I watched the attending barely glance at the images before he left the room. Walter stood up. He pulled out his phone and said, "I'll make the call tonight." "Whatever this costs you," I said. "Time, trouble, I'll make it right." He looked at me for a long moment. "Your husband was my best friend for 50 years, he said. "We're not discussing money right now." He left to make the call, and I lay in the half-dark and thought about the ring on my finger and the dock facing east and the specific quality of light on Georgian Bay just before sunrise. I had built something real in this life. I was not going to let it be dismantled in a hospital corridor while I was still breathing. The next morning, my son arrived with his wife and a folder of papers. He had the practiced look of someone who had rehearsed his expression on the drive over: concerned, gentle, just worried about you. My daughter-in-law placed a Tim Hortons coffee on my tray table without asking if I wanted it. A small gesture, establishing comfort in the space around me, ease of ownership. I had watched witnesses do similar things in interview rooms for 2 decades. A small act that announces, "I belong here now." "Mom, the doctor thought it would be good to have someone with authority in place," my son said, opening the folder. "Just in case things move quickly and you can't, you know." "I know exactly what a power of attorney for property is," I said. "I have drafted them, I have opposed them, I have watched people lose everything to them in the time it takes to sign a page." I looked at him steadily. "I am invoking my right under the Healthcare Consent Act to make my own medical and financial decisions. I have already asked the nursing team to note that in my chart. If either of you approaches a staff member about my capacity, I will be speaking to the patient advocate before you reach the elevator." The folders stayed closed, neither of them touched it again. When they left, I adjusted myself against the pillows and let myself breathe. 2 mornings later, at 6:15, my phone rang. Miss Colquhoun," the specialist said, "and that is my name, Bridget Colquhoun, formerly of the Crown's office in Hamilton. I've reviewed your imaging carefully, along with your blood work and clinical notes. The initial reading was not accurate. Your ejection fraction is reduced, but not to the degree the first report suggested. This is stage B heart failure, not stage D. It is entirely manageable with medication, appropriate lifestyle changes, and regular monitoring. With proper treatment, there is every reason to expect you have a decade or more ahead of you. You are not in the final stage of anything." I thanked him. I said I'd be in touch about a formal referral. Then I went to the bathroom, turned the tap on full, and held the edge of the sink with both hands, while the kind of crying I had not allowed myself since my husband's funeral moved through me like a current. My whole body shook. I pressed my forehead against the cold mirror. The water ran over my wrists and down the drain and took something with it. The terror, maybe, that I'd been holding below the surface since the moment the first doctor had given me his verdict with the casual detachment of someone reading a weather report. When I lifted my head, the woman in the mirror was not a dying woman. She was a woman who had spent 22 years building airtight cases against people who believed they were untouchable. I dried my face with a rough paper towel and walked back to the bed and picked up my phone. I called the sharpest estates lawyer I knew, my former colleague from the Crown's office, who had moved into private practice years ago and built a reputation that made real estate developers nervous. I told her everything. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said, "I'll drive down tomorrow. Don't sign a single thing before I get there." For the next 2 weeks, I gave an extraordinary performance of a woman declining. When my son visited, I let my responses be slower. I left sentences half-finished. I closed my eyes at convenient moments. My daughter-in-law brought things: lip balm, a cashmere throw she had clearly purchased that morning and still had the receipt folded in her pocket. And I accepted them with the vague gratitude of someone who no longer fully understood what was happening around them. Meanwhile, Walter was my eyes and ears. He had a gift for invisibility I had always noticed, the ability to be present in a room without claiming it, to hear what was said in the moments people believed they were unobserved. He visited daily, bringing soup he made himself, sitting quietly near the window. He listened. He photographed. When my son left a folder of financial projections in the family lounge down the hall, Careless, arrogant, certain no one relevant was watching. Walter photographed every page and sent them to my colleague. What we found: a numbered company registered in Alberta 3 months earlier, a plan to transfer the Georgian Bay property into that company, jointly controlled by my son and daughter-in-law, before any estate proceedings could be initiated, a spreadsheet estimating the liquidation value of my RIF accounts, my investment portfolio, and the cottage, all of it annotated in their handwriting, a notation in the margin beside the cottage valuation, in my daughter-in-law's precise script. Check if RSP transfer triggers CRA clawback, ask lawyer. My colleague worked through 2 weekends. She established an irrevocable trust in my name, structured carefully under Ontario law, with Walter and herself named as co-trustees. Every asset I owned moved behind a legal wall that could not be accessed without my explicit consent and a court order: the cottage, the investments, the RRIF accounts, the insurance policies. The numbered company my son had registered in Alberta became, effectively, a structure built to receive assets that were no longer there, a door with no house behind it. I refused the revised power of attorney my son brought the following week, on principle, even though there was nothing left for it to touch. He suggested, with the careful wording of someone who had been coached, that I might want to convalesce at the cottage. Fresh air, quiet, better for recovery than a hospital room. He and his wife would stay on to help manage things. Her parents might come by, just to keep everything comfortable. I said that sounded lovely. I understood exactly what it was: an isolated property, no hospital oversight, a controlled environment where documents could be produced and witnesses would be his witnesses, not mine. I said yes because I needed him to keep believing he was winning. The weekend we drove up to Georgian Bay was cold and bright, that particular October light that makes you understand why people stay in Ontario through every difficult winter. The maples still burning orange and red along the shoreline, the smell of wood smoke and spruce needles, the water a deep pewter green. I let my son help me from the car. I walked slowly. I took his arm. My colleague arrived 2 hours later, parked on the road rather than the laneway, and came in through the back path along the property line carrying a wine bottle in a basket. She introduced herself to my daughter-in-law as an old friend, which was not untrue. My daughter-in-law glanced at her once and returned to arranging things in the kitchen with the focused energy of a woman who has been imagining that kitchen as hers for months. Walter arrived at 4. He brought with him 2 people he had quietly called: my neighbor from the property 2 lots down, who had known my husband for 20 years, and a retired Ontario Superior Court judge he stayed in touch with, a man who had no formal role in any of this, but whose presence in a room tends to alter the calculations of people who believe they are beyond consequence. My daughter-in-law's parents were there, 2 of my son's colleagues. A couple I knew socially, invited, I understood, to provide the impression of a full, supportive gathering that he was caring devotedly for his ailing mother. At 5 o'clock, my son stood by the fireplace my husband had built with stone pulled from the lakeshore, a project that had taken him and Walter most of one summer, cutting and fitting each piece, and he began to speak about family alignment during difficult times, about getting things in order, about the importance of his taking a more active role in managing the estate's affairs going forward. I let him finish. Then I stood up from the Muskoka chair near the window, my husband's chair, the one where he drank his coffee every morning looking out at the water, and I walked to the dock table where I had placed, before anyone arrived, a small digital recorder, the clean specialist's report from Toronto General, and the trust documents fully executed and filed with the Land Registry Office the previous Thursday. The dock boards under my feet were solid. My husband had replaced them 6 years ago. Good pressure-treated lumber, properly spaced, built to last. I pressed play on the recorder. 800,000 on the low end. Once she signs the POA, we move fast. The ring? I wanted appraised. My cousin knows someone in Yorkville. The recording was not long. It didn't need to be. Every person on that dock went still. My son's face went through several things in quick succession. I had watched that particular sequence before. In courtrooms, during trials, at the moment a defendant understands that the evidence is not going to move in their direction. My daughter-in-law set down her glass very carefully on the railing, as though sudden movements might make things worse. I am not dying, I said. The specialist's report is here if anyone would like to read it. My condition is stage B, managed and expected to remain stable with treatment. I laid the report beside the recorder. Every asset I own has been placed in an irrevocable trust. The cottage, the accounts, the investments, none of it can be transferred without the co-trustee's consent and a court order. The numbered company registered in Alberta 3 months ago was created to receive assets that are no longer available to it. The retired judge near the back of the deck said nothing. He didn't need to. I want you both to leave, I said. Take your things. Leave my key on the kitchen counter. My son started to speak, something about misunderstandings, about context, about the medications affecting my perspective. I had heard versions of that speech many times. I waited until he ran out of words. I spent more than 2 decades listening to explanations, I said. I have heard considerably better ones. His car was gone before 6. The laneway gravel was very loud in the quiet. The rest of us stayed and ate dinner. My son's lawyer filed a capacity challenge in Ontario Superior Court 6 weeks later. The claim was undue influence. Walter named specifically an impaired mental state at the time of signing. My colleague had anticipated every line of it. She submitted the specialist's report, dated 3 days before the trust documents were signed. She entered the hospital nursing notes, which documented multiple instances of my son asking staff about my cognitive status during visits and being told I was fully alert and oriented. She presented the financial projections Walter had photographed, annotated in both their handwriting, as evidence of the intent that had motivated the challenge. The court-appointed capacity assessor spent 4 hours with me across 2 sessions. Her report found clarity, detailed and accurate memory, appropriate emotional range, and legal knowledge substantially above the general population baseline. Her assessment did not support a finding of incapacity. The challenge was dismissed. I sat in that courtroom and watched my son hear the ruling. He looked smaller than I remembered him being. I thought about the summers he had learned to cast a fishing line off that dock with Walter's patient instruction. About the sandwiches I used to make at 7 in the morning before anyone else was awake. About the particular quality of his laugh when he was young and hadn't yet learned to calculate everything. That part of my love for him did not go anywhere. It became something I carried separately from any decision I would ever make about property or money or trust. His marriage didn't survive the pressure. My daughter-in-law moved back to Toronto 8 months after the ruling. My son sent messages occasionally, first sharp, then explanatory, then carefully warm. The last one came on a Tuesday in March and mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he was dealing with some investment losses and things were tight. I read it on the dock, in the cold with my coffee, and then put my phone in my pocket and watched a loon surface 30 meters out. I watched it dive again. I finished my coffee. I called Walter that afternoon and told him I had enough of silence and wanted to take him for dinner somewhere decent. He laughed and said he knew a place in Collingwood that didn't charge Toronto prices for Ontario perch. Before we went, I sat him down in the main room, where my husband's bookshelves still lined the north wall, where the crooked window frame Walter had argued about for 1 full summer was still crooked, and I handed him the documents. A registered interest in the cottage property, 15% transferred to his name, filed with the Land Registry Office and fully executed, and a monthly income from the trust's investment returns, enough to close the gap in his pension, enough that the cracked windshield would no longer be a financial calculation. He held the papers for a long time without looking at them. I didn't do any of this for money, he said finally. I know, I said, that's why it's yours. He looked up at my husband's photograph on the shelf, taken on this dock, the summer we finished the edition, both of them squinting into the afternoon sun, my husband's hand on Walter's shoulder, both of them grinning at something just out of frame. Walter pressed his lips together and nodded once, the way men of a certain generation nod when something is too large for words. The trust now supports 2 things. The cottage will remain accessible to a rotating group of families, the children of my husband's former employees, old friends who never owned waterfront property, people who should know what it feels like to sit on a dock and watch the sun come up over Georgian Bay with nothing requiring their attention. And a small annual bursary, named after my husband, goes to a law student from a working-class background at McMaster University, the kind of student who does it on loans and part-time work and stubbornness, the kind I was. My name is on the trust documents, his name is on the bursary. That's the way it should be. It's November now. The maples have dropped everything. The dock is quiet in the mornings, the water gray-green and cold, the loon's already gone south for the season. Walter comes up every other weekend. We drink coffee in good mugs and talk about nothing in particular, and sometimes we talk about my husband, and sometimes we sit without saying anything and watch the water, and that is also enough. The ring is back on my finger. I'd had it in the hospital safe for the entire duration, and I put it back the morning Dr. Ramirez called with the clean report. It doesn't cost much. It costs exactly what my husband paid for it at a barn sale in Listowel in 1994, which was $60, which was, by any measure that has ever mattered to me, everything. My son is somewhere out there, adjusting to a smaller life than he had planned for. I don't feel sorry for him. I feel something else, quieter, harder to name, like looking at a photograph of someone you once knew very well, taken in a year that seems far away now. Some mornings I sit on the dock in the cold and think about what it means to build something. Not just the physical thing, the foundation, the walls, the dock, and the properly spaced boards. But the other kind of building, the kind that happens in the in-between moments. When you drive 4 hours on a cold October weekend because a friend asked, when you show up in the rain and stay when others leave, when you carry a casket and then wash the dishes and then come back the next spring and the spring after that. My husband understood that kind of building. He taught it to Walter. He tried to teach it to our son. You cannot force someone to learn what loyalty actually costs. I finished my coffee and went inside to start the fire.